The purpose of the paper, The Colonial Origins of Comparative Development, is to estimate the effects of institutions on economic performance. The way the authors go about trying to measure the magnitude of this effect is by building a regression using mortality rates of European settlers as an instrument variable for current institutions. The logic behind using this methodology follows 5 steps. That the mortality rates will affect the characteristics of early European settlements, that the characteristics of these early settlements will affect the early institutions developed in these areas, that the early institutions will have an effect on the later institutions, and then finally, that the later institutions will have an effect on GDP or income. The authors show early on in their paper that there is a strong negative correlation between the natural logarithm of GDP per capita and the natural logarithm of the mortality rates for European settlers. The logic that they then use to try and explain this strong negative relationship is that Europeans would categorize potential areas to settle into 2 main categories. The first category being areas that are ideal for settlement, with low mortality rates for settlers, and these areas would merit heavy investment of human and financial capital. And in order to maximize the benefit gained from this heavy investment, they would establish very strong institutions and legal groundwork and really make sure they had all the infrastructure to get the most out of all the energy they were putting into these areas. On the other hand, they had the second category, which was areas that had very high mortality rates. They were called extraction zones. The reason that they referred to these as extraction zones is the high mortality rates were a very strong deterrent for sending lots of settlers, and it created the goal of trying to get as much as you can by giving as little as you can. Obviously, this policy did not leave a lot of room for the development of strong institutions and proper legal frameworks, as these areas were simply being taken for all they had and not being given much in return. A few examples of the areas ideal for settlement would be the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, all of which today have developed into very strong economic countries. And examples of zones that were considered extraction zones be the Ivory Coast, the Gold Coast, and various parts of Central South America and Africa. The paper goes on to discuss various biases that could affect the regressions used, and the authors use a variety of controls to see if it's possible that other factors or variables that are correlated to settler death rates might actually be what's affecting the quality of institutions and current institutions. A few examples of this were disease, origin of colonizers, and the locations of the colonies themselves. The authors mentioned that past research has pointed at the aforementioned factors as probable causes for economic inequality. The paper also mentions the work of Jared Diamond, who wrote the book Gun, Germs, and Steel, in which he expresses how he feels that locational factors are key determinants in how societies develop economically. I found this article to be fascinating. As someone who grew up originally in the United States and spent 8 months of the past year living in Mexico, 2 locations very geographically close to one another, but with completely different economic situations, the question of why was very prominent. And having read previously Gun, Germs, and Steel, it was really interesting to see the economic angle taken by the authors of this paper and their statistical approach as opposed to Jared Diamond's anthropological approach to assessing the situation and how they separated the effects of location from settler mortality rates in their regressions. I thought was very, very interesting.